Session is a drop-in session about role plays with TAFE Digital for the community services sector. So this is not your assessment. So if you logged in thinking that this was going to be your role play assessment, that's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is a chance for students to get some information about how the role plays look and work for community services at TAFE Digital. So we will be going through a little bit of an overview around how to prepare for role play. We'll cover some common questions that students ask us about role plays. We will go through looking at some of the kind of core communication skills that you might use in your role plays. And there will be a chance for you to ask some questions as we're going along. Okay. So this is the role play drop-in session that you're participating in. Nice to have you all with us, and it's nice to see some familiar faces. So just as a reminder for the people that have maybe just joined us, we are recording this session. And by staying logged into this session, you're granting TAFE permission to use this recording for teaching purposes. So this recording may be used by students who are unable to attend the live session. They'll be able to go back and watch the session and gain the information that we've been discussing. It will also allow you to go back and rewatch the session if you wanted a reminder of anything. If you do not want to be involved in the recording, now would be a good time to log out, please. And just as a reminder, even if you have your camera switched off, your details may still be recorded in the session via things like the chat box, for example. So if you do not want to be involved in the recording, now would be a good time to log out. So before we start talking about role plays, I just would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're all coming together on. As TAFE Digital students, we're coming together from all over New South Wales and possibly even interstate. But we are also all coming together on Aboriginal land. And so I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land that we're all meeting on, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also extend my thanks and respects to any Aboriginal students that we may have in this session with us. And just acknowledge that we're all here as TAFE students. We're here to learn. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that wisdom and learnings have been being passed down for thousands and thousands of years in Australia through the traditional custodian of the land that we're on in a variety of different ways. So Vicky's just popped a little reminder in the chat box asking people to pop their name and TAFE ID in the chat box, please. And again, if you're not sure how to do that, I will show you in a moment. I'm just going to invite Vicky to just make a comment around how we use this space, I suppose. You know, I suppose we might think about it setting just a few little ground rules around how we approach this space and how we make use of it to ensure that we all feel like we're getting our needs met in this space.
Thanks, Glenn. Welcome everyone. So it's great to have you come on board with us today. So just a couple of little things, I guess we used to call them housekeeping things to consider, is that remember that this is a shared space and it's a classroom environment. So if we were in a face-to-face class, we would be respecting when, you know, the presenter is speaking, and we would wait for another student to finish saying what they were saying. So we ask for that same respect and consideration in this space as well. So it's you know, we're going to be working within an industry where it's essentially important that we respect all our clients, and it can start very well in this space. So we ask that you speak respectfully, that you don't use abusive language or aggressive language towards the presenter or any other student, that you raise your hand if you have something that you wish to say or in response to a question that may be asked, and then the presenter will actually indicate when you can speak. So it's a learning space. So quite often, because we learn differently, we may need to ask questions in regard to clarification, but it also is that we need to respect that another person may take more time to process something. And when we treat ourselves with respect, we hopefully think that that should flow on, have that respectful way in which we speak. It also applies if you're writing in the chat pod. If for some reason that you feel that there is something really that you need to say, you want to say it emphatically, please be mindful of the language that you use as well, because that can constitute abuse if you use certain forms of language. If you really have a pressing need to speak to someone personally, please think of that afterwards. And if I could just ask, I'm getting feedback, so can you just mute your microphones if you're not speaking, because it gives feedback, and then it makes it more difficult to hear. So thank you for your attendance, and I guess it really goes without saying that we will act respectfully to each other. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Vicky. So some folks, I think, have attended this session before, and it's great to have you back with us. But for other folks, it might be your first time here. So we are going to now just have a look at some MS Teams basics. Some just some basic kind of functions that Teams have that are going to be used by you when you do your role plays, but you also might want to make use of them in this session as well. So what I'm going to do, folks, is I'm just going to change my shared screen. Okay, just bear with me one moment. So hopefully folks can now see my screen, and this is my Teams page. And I'm going to show you where a couple of very important functions are. So Vicky just made mention of the microphone, and we ask that people have their microphones on mute if they're not actively asking a question. So to turn your microphone on and off, the instructions I'm about to give relate to PCs and laptops. They might be slightly different if you're on a phone, for example. To turn our microphones on and off, we can see there's a little icon at the top of the screen here that my cursor is pointing to. And it looks like a bit of an old-fashioned radio microphone, and it has mic written underneath it, okay? So my microphone is currently on and folks can hear me. If I wanted to turn my microphone to mute, all I would do is click this button and you will notice a line will go through it. And to turn my microphone back on, I just push that button again and the line disappears. Okay, so that's our microphone. We also have our camera function. Okay, now when you do your role play, you will absolutely need to make sure you have access to a device that the microphone is working and the camera is working. Okay, and the reason for that is because the teacher, when they're doing the assessment with you, needs to be able to see you and observe things like your body language. So we can still observe body language even though we're on Teams, okay? So to turn your cameras on and off, my camera is off at the moment, and we know that because there's a little camera icon here. and my cursor is pointing at it, it looks like a bit of an old-fashioned video camera. Okay. So there's a line through it, so that means my camera is currently off. If I wanted to turn my camera on, I will click that icon, and you will notice that my camera now appears. Okay. So it is really important for your role plays that you have a device that the camera and the microphone functions are working on. Okay, so that's our microphone and our camera. Now, the next thing I will show you is we've mentioned the chat box a few times, okay? And that's where we're asking students to put their contact, their TAFE ID details. So to turn the chat box on, we go over to this little icon here. It looks like a speech bubble and it says chat underneath it. Now, when I click that, you will notice on the side that the chat box appears and you can see that people have been typing in it. So I can type in the chat box. This is the chat box. Now, please remember that, as Vicky said, whatever you type in this chat box, everybody else will be able to see. So as soon as I hit enter, my message has been posted to the chat box and everybody that's in this session can see my message, okay? So if you want to have a private conversation with somebody in this session, please don't use the public chat box to do that, okay? Because everybody will be able to see what you're saying. So this is how we type in the chat box. And you can see down here, there's also things like we can make use of emojis, for example, for folks who like to do that. And I'm going to ask you to do that in just a moment to make sure that people are kind of understanding how to use Teams. Okay, so Vicky also mentioned raising your hand. So the way we can do that on Teams, if you've got your camera on, you can literally put your hand up. But if you don't have your camera on, the way you can raise your hand is through this function that says reactions, okay? So the icon looks like a hand and a little smiley face emoji. Now, if I hover my icon on that, we get this little drop-down box of different reactions. And this one here is how we raise our hand, okay? So you might see that my hand is now up, okay? Once I've asked my question, I can then put my hand down. And there's one more function that I would like to show you, and that is how you can turn on closed captions or text live captioning for your session, okay? So the way we do that is we go to these three dots here that say more. And when I click on that, I get a drop-down box with lots of different options. So if I wanted to turn on live captions, I would select it here, turn on live captions. I push the button and hopefully you can all see that as I'm speaking, it's being converted into text at the bottom of my screen. Live captions is a private function. So what I mean by that is nobody else will know if you have turned on live captions. It will only appear on your screen. It doesn't appear on everybody else's screen. So you can turn that on privately, knowing that other people won't know that you've done it. Live captions can be helpful, for example, if you're in an area where maybe there's a bit of background noise and it's hard to hear, for example. Maybe you prefer to read things as opposed to just listen to things, so you might be able to use live captions for that as well. Or maybe you're experiencing some hearing difficulties, and again, live captions can be helpful with that. Okay, I'm going to turn the live captions off for now, and that will remind us how to do it. We go to the three dots that say more. We click and we get our drop-down box, and now I'm going down to turn off live captions. So they're just some very kind of basic team functions that you will need to know how to use when you're doing your role plays. You'll definitely need to know how to use the microphone and the camera, and the chat box can also be helpful doing the role plays, especially if you have like technical difficulties and you need to let the teacher know. Okay, I'm just going to change the shared screen again. Okay, so what I'm going to ask folks to do is just take a moment to post an emoji in the chat box, please, that best fits how you're feeling today. Now, if you'd prefer to post a comment, that's okay. Some people don't like emojis, not a problem. But it's just an opportunity for you. Natalie's used the reactions function, wonderful. It's just an opportunity for you to get used to figuring out how to use Teams functions. I can see Chris has got like a bit of a you know, happy, funny face there. That's wonderful. Nikki's got a nice smiley face, great. Jasmine, there's kind of like a big smiley laughing face, wonderful. So we can see that folks are kind of getting used to using the Teams functions, so that's really great to see. So thank you, folks. You can type your questions into the chat box, and both Vicky and I will be monitoring the chat box as we're going, because sometimes people might type a question in there, and we can make sure that we try to answer it for you. Okay. And I can see there's lots of other smiley, happy faces coming up in the chat box, so that's great. Thanks, folks, for that. Okay. So the way we usually start this session is by going over some kind of role play essentials. Now, the information that we discuss here is based on commonly asked questions that students have. So we've tried to capture some of that information that students often ask us about, so we can share that information with you all. So the first thing that we'll chat about is how do you prepare for role plays? Students will often ask about how do I get ready for a role play? Jade, I just saw your hand go up. Did you have a question? No, it's gone back down. If you do have a question, Jade, please feel free to either type it in the chat box or pop your hand back up. So preparing for role plays. Okay, so there's a few kind of main steps that we encourage students to do as part of their role play preparation. So the first thing that we ask students to do, or we encourage students to do, is to read the case studies that relate to the role play. So in your role plays, you will usually have 3 clients that you're going to work with, and there is usually case study information about those clients, okay? So the first thing we encourage students to do is to read through the case studies. Now, this is an example of one of the case studies that you would find in the Cluster 2 role play, okay? If you're a Cert 4 student, you do role plays in Cluster 2, and this is one of the case studies from there. So we encourage students to read through the role plays, and lots of students have told us that when they're reading through the role plays, they find it really helpful to highlight or make notes about particular bits of information in the role play that kind of stand out as maybe being important, or that maybe kind of looks to them like, oh, I'm a bit curious about what that might mean for this client, okay? So we've got an example of that here for this particular case study. So you can see here that, you know, when we read through this case study, we're highlighting things like we're noticing, okay, it's saying that we're a male worker. So that's important for us to remember. It's saying things like we work at a community centre. So that's important for us to remember because it gives us a little bit of direction about, you know, the type of service we're a part of. It says here that a family has recently moved to the area. So that's useful for us to know. It's not like an individual person, it's a family. It also tells us things like the family has come to Australia seeking asylum. That seems like pretty important information for us to be aware of. It tells us information like this family come from a non-English speaking background, or English is a second language. That might be useful information for us to be aware of because maybe we want to check with this client if they'd like an interpreter, for example. We can see here that it talks about the client is looking for referrals, in particular around healthcare. So again, this gives us some little, I suppose, clues about things that we might be curious about in this role play, or that we might want to speak with this client about. So the first way to prepare is to read through the case studies, and if you can, make some little notes or highlight things that are important to you. Okay. Now, the next thing that we ask students to do is have a look at the observation checklist. Okay. So I've got an example of what an observation checklist looks like here. Now, the observation checklist is what the teacher will use when they're assessing you or marking you during the role play. Now, the reason this is really helpful for students to look at is because it gives you clues or tips about the kinds of skills and knowledge that we're looking for students to demonstrate during the role play. So, for example, this is an observation checklist for the Cluster 2 role plays in Certificate 4. And we can see here, in order to pass this role play, I need to demonstrate active listening. I need to make sure I demonstrate the use of reflection and paraphrasing skills because they're listed here. It says, you know, I need to use appropriate body language. So by looking at the observation checklist, it's giving me some little helpful tips and clues on the kinds of things I need to demonstrate in the role play. We can see over here, for example, one of the things I need to do in Cluster 2 role plays is I need to demonstrate that I've recognised the potential for misunderstandings during my conversation with the client. And there's some extra clues there. It says that this could include language barriers, gender issues, religious practices, experiences and expectations of services, or cultural responses to authority. So again, this is giving me some clues. If I'm working with a client, for example, and it says that English is their second language, this gives me a clue that I might want to check about, you know, are there any language barriers that I might need to, you know, support the client around? Or, you know, it mentions here gender issues. If we go back to this case study, it mentions that we're a male worker and we're working with the mother and daughter, and they seem a bit uncomfortable. So maybe there's a clue there about something that's happening for these clients that we might want to pick up and check in around their comfort working with a male. Okay? So that's why it's really helpful for us to have a look at the observation checklist. Okay, and that is in your assessment document. That's where you'll find this information. The case studies and the observation checklist are in your assessment documents. Okay. So once you've read through the observation checklist and you've had a read through the case studies, we then encourage students to have a think about and do a little bit of research around possible referral services that they think the client might be interested in. So for example, we can see in our case study, it says that this client is looking for local services, in particular healthcare providers. So we might want to do a bit of research for our role play around what local health services are there that could be suitable for this client. Perhaps we do some research around, are there any local health services that work specifically with women? Or are there any local health services that work specifically with people who've come to Australia as refugees? So we're encouraging you to do a bit of research around possible referral agencies as well. Okay, there's a really great website called Ask Izzy that you can use to do a little bit of that research, but you can also make use of a range of other resources as well. And when you're looking for services, we do want them to be real services, okay? Because as part of your assessment, you may need to also write a referral letter, for example, for a client. So we do ask that students are making referrals to real organisations. Okay. So that's, the last step for preparing is, if at all possible, can you do some practice? Do you have a friend or a family member, for example, that you might be able to do a little bit of a practice session with? Some students have said they practice in front of the mirror. You know, they just take a moment to kind of sit at home in front of a mirror or record themselves, practicing kind of how they might greet a client or how they might ask a question and those kinds of things. Okay, so doing a little bit of practice can be helpful. So the next thing that students often ask about is who is in the role plays and what's their job? What are they there doing, basically? So generally speaking, it will only be you and the teacher in the role play session. Okay, so they're not big group sessions like we're in at the moment. They're individual sessions. So it will just be you and the teacher that you're doing the assessment with. Okay, now the teacher has two main jobs in the role plays. So one of the jobs the teachers have is that they will play the client for you in each of the scenarios. So they will be playing the role of the client. The other job the teacher has is that they're also doing the assessment component. So that means that they're observing the skills that you're demonstrating and the knowledge that you're showing. Okay. One of the benefits of teachers having those two jobs is that because they are doing the assessment component, they know the skills and the knowledge that they're looking for. So that often means that they will play your clients in a way that supports you or encourages you or prompts you to demonstrate certain skills, or gives you the opportunity to show off certain knowledge. Okay. So it is a benefit that the teacher has those two jobs because they're there to support you in the role play process as well. Now, in the role plays, although it's an assessment task, TAFE Digital really does look at it as an extension of your learning experience with us. So what that means is during the role plays, it is okay for you to, for example, just pause for a moment to gather your thoughts. It is okay for you to say, oh, can I just stop for a moment? Can I just clarify something with you? So you can pause in the role play and just clarify things with a teacher if you need to do that. Teachers are also there to give you feedback in real time. So this is one of the things that students tell us they love about role plays, because they actually get feedback then and there from the teachers. So after each of your role plays that you do, the teacher will offer you feedback. They'll chat with you about the things that you've done well, the skills that you've demonstrated, and they might also offer some suggestions around areas that you might like to focus more on in the next role play. Okay, so you get feedback in real time as you're going through each of the role plays from the teacher. Okay, the role plays aren't recorded. Okay, so the role play is not recorded by the teachers. So they record notes themselves, like typing up notes for you. That's how you get your feedback after the session that you upload to the OLS. Okay, so they will type up feedback, but they do not record sessions. Now, it's important as well to remember that you're not being assessed on your acting skills. So what we're asking you to do is approach the session as, as you, the worker. So you're not playing character. You're coming to the session simply as you, the worker. Okay. Because it's not an acting class, what that means is from time to time, you will be using your imagination. So for example, in some of the role plays, the clients might identify as being female.
Unknown caller.
If I'm doing a role play with a student, I identify as being male. So if I'm playing a female client, I don't change my voice, or I don't kind of put on an accent or things like that. We just imagine that I am a female in that session. Okay, and similarly for you, you're not expected, if it says that you're playing a male worker, you're not expected to, put on a different voice or change the way you speak or anything like that. We just imagine that that's the case in that particular scenario. Okay. Now, as I've mentioned, the role plays are a great opportunity to get feedback in real time from teachers. They're also a great opportunity for you to practice the skills and knowledge that you've been learning about as part of your written assignments. So students often say that although they're very nervous when they start the role play, which is a very natural way to feel, students often say at the end that they found them actually really enjoyable, that they found the experience helpful, and they liked the chance to kind of show off their skills, you know, to kind of to practice the things that they've been reading about. So it really is an opportunity for you to practice those skills and get prepared for how you might use those skills in a work environment, because many of you will be going into work placement as well. So this is a chance to practice skills that will help you in the work placement. Okay. Now, we've spoken about the fact that you can ask questions during your role play session. The teachers are there to not only do the assessment component, but to support you with your learning. So you can ask questions, you can clarify things about the scenarios as you're going along in the session, okay? I've just seen someone's popped their hand up. Bakra, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Bakra. I see your hand is up. Did you have a question? Okay, so Bakra's question, thanks for typing it in the chat box. The question says, is the observation checklist a marking criteria, or is there a separate marking criteria we're able to use? That's a really wonderful question. The observation checklist is the marking criteria. So that's what you're being marked against. Okay, so I'll just go back and show you what it looks like. So this document, the observation checklist, is what teachers are using to mark you on your role plays. Okay, so good question, Bakra. Thank you for asking. Yes, the observation checklist is your marking guide, okay, your marking criteria. Okay, so generally, the things that you're going to be assessed on, because students will often ask, you know, what am I being assessed on? What things are teachers looking for? So generally, the things that you're being assessed on are the following. You're usually being assessed on your ability to connect with the client. So, you know, that's like building rapport with the client, building a relationship with the client. So that's things like, you know, introducing yourself to the client, introducing the service to the client, you know, asking some very kind of simple introductory questions. Maybe you ask how their morning's been. Maybe you ask, you know, what they've been up to during the week. You might offer them a tea or a coffee or something like that. Okay, so one of the things we're usually assessing students on is their ability to build rapport with the client. Also, we're usually assessing students around their communication skills. So that's things, and Vicky's going to talk a little bit more about communication skills in a moment. But communication skills are things like using open questions to hear more of the client's story. Things like demonstrating your active listening skills. Things like paraphrasing what your client is saying. But it's also things like your body language. That's why you need to have your camera accessible, because you are being assessed on your body language during role plays as well. Usually as well, we're looking at things like students taking what's called a person-centered approach to their work. So that's where we partner with our clients. That's where we want to hear from our clients what their story is. We want to hear from our clients what their strengths are. We want to hear from our clients what they think is going to be helpful and useful for them. Okay? So we're usually looking for a person-centered approach. And then we're looking for what would be called like specific skills or knowledge. So that might be things like you might be asked in the observation checklist to set SMART goals with a client, for example. you might be asked to demonstrate a recovery-oriented approach through the work you're doing with a client, for example. So these are more unit or subject-specific skills, okay? So that's why it's really important to have a look at the observation checklist, because it will specify some of those more specific skills or knowledge that relates to the cluster of units that you're currently studying, okay? Now, to book your role plays, because students will often ask us that as well, to book your role plays, we'll contact the teaching section. So you can phone or email the teaching section and ask to book your role plays. Now, when you book your role plays, it will usually take around about 2 weeks at least to have a window of opportunity for role play. The reason for that is because TAFE Digital have about 12,000 students and just about all of them need to do role plays at some point during their courses. So role plays, there is quite a high demand to do role plays. So give yourself like a little bit of a window period. So don't wait until a week out from your course end date to book in your last role plays in cluster 7, for example. Okay, so it usually takes around about 2 weeks to get that window period. But we do have teachers doing role plays 5 days a week, and teachers, there's many teachers who do role plays outside of business hours as well. Okay, so one of the team will liaise with you around your best days and times to book a role play, and then they will book that in for you with a teacher. Okay. So any questions or comments at the moment about kind of just some of the basic role play essentials that we've just discussed? Any questions or comments so far? And please remember, it's absolutely fine for you to ask questions as we're going along. Okay. So I'm going to hand over to Vicky now, and Vicky is going to chat with you about and give you some examples around some of the communication skills that students generally need to demonstrate in their role plays. And these are often questions that students ask us when they call in preparation for their role plays. You know, they often ask about things like, how do I build rapport with a client? Or what if I don't know the client's gender? How should I ask about gender in a role play and these kinds of things? So we're going to have a little bit of a look at that now. So I'll hand over to you, Vicky, and I'll watch the chat box in case there's questions.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. Great introduction there to the role play. So once we come to the role plays, I guess this is where most people feel the anxiety. I've logged in, I'm sitting there waiting for the teacher to come, and my anxiety level's really building. What I say to students is the best thing to be when you come to a role play is your natural self. Be your natural self. Because when we are working with people and we have new clients, we need to be our natural self. Otherwise, there's an inconsistency. If we were to see the client again, they're seeing this chameleon if we're not our natural self. Because obviously we're going to interact with the person with a genuineness to build that rapport. But we will also have demeanour or a presentation that is respectful of where the person or the client is at that point in time. So we would not be overjoyed if we have had somebody come as a client that was we could tell was in deep distress. So we would be acting appropriately, but we need to be genuine as well, because a client will always pick up and build trust when we are genuine, our genuine self. If we're not, it comes across as ingenuity, and people then may go away thinking, I really didn't feel heard, I really didn't feel as though I was valued. as a person, an individual person. And we're working here, we're talking about a person-centered model. We're thinking how we are focused on the individual. So the first thing in building rapport is to be your genuine self. So we're also wanting to welcome somebody to the organisation, and in the role play, people say to me, well, I don't know what I'm going to say in the role. Generally, the actual teacher themselves, they will say to you, well, I will give you cues, or what I say in the role play will also inform you. And if you are missing something, listen to the questions or the answers or responses that the teacher is giving to you as they are speaking. They will sometimes prompt you if you're missing something, but the important thing is that first connection. So what do I do when I first connect with somebody? Introduce myself. Hi, good morning. Welcome to the service. My name is Vicky, and I'm the case manager that will be working with you today. How are you? How have you been? Was it difficult to get here today? So it's sort of like an icebreaker. We're breaking the ice. We're starting to acknowledge the individual person and start informing them who I am, what my role play is, what the purpose of my purpose is to hear what they have to say, why they've come. And I've introduced myself. I've provided my name, so they know then what to call me. I could say my preferred name is Vicky. I may say, good morning, my name's Vicky. My preferred pronouns are she and her. So that indicates to people that we are an inclusive society and recognise and understand that gender and that we are inclusive of LGBTQ diversity, and we recognise that, so that it can immediately put a person at ease. So in one of the role plays we are a lot of students struggle with is that it's a role play where a transgender woman has come to the service, left because she has felt discriminated against, but there were some really important non-connection points in the initial contact that the worker from the organisation failed in being able to connect with that with the transgender person. And the way in which they may have been able to dispel that was in their very first initial introduction. Good morning, my preferred name is Vicky. My pronouns are she and her. That immediately gives an opportunity for a person to respond, oh, hi, my name's Linda. My pronouns are she and her also. So it's about us actively listening as well. When a person first comes in, they may give you quite a bit of information in their first conversation. So actively listening, we can be picking up some of those points already. So it may be, oh, yes, I've come by the bus. We don't have a car, so I've had to come by the bus today. Gee, there was a lot of rain around. I'm really rushed. I've had a bad week. I'm not quite sure how the kids are going. And so they're giving you information. You may be picking up some issues already in that first conversation through your active listening. So it's not just hearing without picking up issues. Sometimes we in our own lives will ask somebody, oh, how are you going today? And before they've even had time to say, oh, okay, or gee, not sure, or we don't observe their body language, their facial expression, or the tone of their voice, we miss things. We're not actively listening. So in the role play, it's important for you to listen to the teacher, the assessor, as they're speaking with you, because they may very well be highlighting some of the issues that you're already, that you can already be starting to think, oh, I might need to open that up a little bit by asking an open question. So an open question is where I will want to have more information given to me rather than just a yes and no. So a closed question could be, so you have a car? No. An open question can be more is, so I'm just wondering how you're feeling today. Could you tell me? And that gives the person some room to make more information available to me. And when the client is advising me that situation or that information, I need to be actively listening. So we talk about reflective listening skills, and it's around using the communication that considers if a person may have a disability and what impact that may have in communication. Or if English is a second language, we're thinking about, is there an impact? Is there going to be a barrier there to me being able to have an information flow to and from? Do I need to slow down my speaking to allow time for the client to process what I'm saying? Might I need to have an interpreter in the session so that they can clarify and speak the language or a language which is a home language of the client so that they can fully understand what's being said. I need to be able to encourage clients to express their views and their opinions. So some of that will mean that I will have some open questions, and that allows space for the individual person to advise me more information. And then I will clarify. I don't need to use complex questions. Remember, complex questions can make a person miss the point of the initial question that I've asked because there's too much complexity in it. There's too many layers in the question. So if I'm going to tease out the issue, I need to ask simply questions that are going to get that information that I need. Don't use jargon. So jargon is phrases that are part of a language that may be just understood by a person that is from that cultural grouping, or it's abbreviations that are specific to a discipline, say a profession, or specific to a workplace. Use words when you are working with a client that you know are going to be able to be understood and interpreted. So if I talk about a general practitioner, if English is a second or third language of someone, or they have only very simple basic English skills, are they going to understand the term practitioner? Would it be better for me to say a doctor or a nurse or a chemist? So it's important for us to understand what can short circuit our flow of conversation. And another important thing is that if you were going to be asking a person around if they could understand what was being said, do they need some clarification, we need to do it respectfully so that it's not an insult to a person. Don't assume that a client does not understand you or doesn't understand you. You need to clarify it with them. And we can do that by paraphrasing back what we believe the client has said. So we can condense what's being said and say it simply back to the client and say, is this what you're saying? So am I understanding you correctly that you have come here today because you're actually wanting to have some assistance with around some health services, and also you've got a problem with your housing. Is that correct? So they may have given you quite a longer sentence, but you're actually paraphrasing it and you're just giving them 2 points to be able to say, oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, I want to see a doctor, and yeah, I'm worried about being moved out of my house because I've not been able to pay the rent. So then they've given you some more information. So it's key parts being spoken of and reflected back to the client. Now, empathy. Empathy is when we are listening to a client, we can hear their narrative, and we're picking up that it may have been a difficult time for the person, or there might be some emotional feelings that is. So it's acknowledging that, being empathetic, not pity, not sympathy, but it's identifying the feeling or the difficulty that the client may have had, and we're acknowledging that by what we say back. So I can hear that you've come to Australia as an asylum seeker. You've told me that it was very difficult back in your homeland. There was times when you were under bombardment. That sounds to me as though it's been a very difficult time for you. So we're empathising, we're acknowledging the feelings, we're acknowledging the difficulty. And our body language needs to match what we're saying. So if we're saying, oh, gee, that's been a difficult time for you, hasn't it? Yeah, gee, oh, well, let's just get back into this. And, you know, you're glancing around, you're not looking or respectfully communicating with the person, your body posture, or you're giving a yawn, you know, through the role play, or your connection or pseudo connection with your client, and the tone is really indicating anything but. So our body language can also indicate an empathetic approach, and that's really important. I liked it when Glenn said, look in the mirror and perhaps look at yourself when doing a mock role play. Another great thing is actually doing a role play with a friend, videoing yourself. Then look at your body language. So have a little bit of an analytical approach when you view the video that you've taken of yourself. Are you sort of looking around? Is there over movement? Because over movement can also be distracting. It's also whether you feel that your approach is being professional. You know, are you presenting yourself professionally? Are you attending to the client? Are you listening to the client while you're actively listening? You're respectfully listening. You may be nodding. Also be aware from if you have a cultural awareness that you're creating a culturally safe space for your client, with understanding of what you're aware of your own home culture as well as the culture of your client. So if there are differences in the way in which you might meet and greet someone, you need to be aware. If I put my hand out to shake a hand of a client, would that be appropriate? It may not be appropriate with the client's home culture. It could be appropriate in my culture, but my cultural awareness tells me I need to have cultural sensitivity and cultural awareness of my client, so that I'm already beginning to disengage the client before I really establish that engagement. Yeah, so yeah, Glenn, back to you, unless there are some questions on that.
Great, thanks, Vicky. A couple of questions have come through.
Yeah.
So there was a question that was asked around what happens if you don't pass your role plays. Do you get a chance to redo it? And when does that happen, or how does that look and work? So that's a really good question, because the answer to that question is the role plays are marked in a similar fashion to all of your assessments at TAFE. which means if you are deemed not yet satisfactory in your first attempt, you are able to redo the role plays. What will usually happen is if you're going through your role play session and the teacher gets a sense that you may not be deemed satisfactory in that particular sitting of the role plays, the teacher will essentially kind of look to shift the focus of that session with you. So they will let you know, they might make a comment, they might say something like, look, Vicky, I've just noticed that perhaps there's parts of the role plays that you're feeling a bit uncomfortable with, and maybe with a little bit more preparation, you might feel a little bit more comfortable in this session. So I'm thinking that at the moment, what might be best is if we stop the assessment and how about we use our time together at the moment for you to ask me some questions. I can give you some guidance, and I can make some suggestions around how to prepare for a follow-up session. Okay, so what I mean by that is usually teachers won't wait until the end of the session to tell a student that they've been deemed unsatisfactory. Okay, because we don't want students to we don't want to waste students' time. And we want, as I said, the teachers are there. Yes, it's an assessment task, but it is actually part of your learning experience with TAFE Digital. So if a teacher is noticing that a student is really struggling with certain aspects of the role plays, they will make comments about that sooner rather than later. Okay, because for some of the role plays that you do, it's a 2-hour session. Okay, so we absolutely, the teaching staff wouldn't want somebody to feel really uncomfortable and to be really struggling for 2 hours. You know, that doesn't seem very fair. What we would look to do instead is, if we think a student is really struggling with the role plays and they're going to be deemed not yet satisfactory, we will have a conversation about that as soon as possible, and we will look to provide some guidance to that student. What that will mean is you will then rebook your role plays for a new time. Okay, so you will need to rebook your role plays for a new time if that occurs. Okay, now sometimes a student in their very first role play, because remember, you do usually you have 3 clients in each role play session. So let's imagine that in your very first client, maybe the way you discussed confidentiality wasn't exactly the way you wanted to. You know, maybe you forgot to make mention about some part of confidentiality. Now, if that happens, if it's a small thing like that, often the teachers, when they're giving you feedback after that role play, will give you that feedback. They might say, look, Vicky, you did a really great job in the role plays. You demonstrated good communication skills. However, you forgot to make mention to the client how confidentiality works around child protection. So in your next 2 role plays, I'm going to be looking out for you to make sure that you mention child protection when you're discussing confidentiality. So in that example, the teacher is saying, I'd like to see some improvement in this area in your next 2 role plays, please. And if you factor that feedback into your next 2 role plays, you will likely be passed or deemed satisfactory. Okay, so if it's a small component of one case study, usually the teachers will give you feedback about how you can improve, and they will be looking for that improvement to take place in your next 2 case studies, for example. I hope I explained that okay for folks. And if you've got more questions about it, please feel free to ask. But you absolutely get to redo your role plays if you are deemed not yet satisfactory the first time around. Okay. Now there is a question that follows on from that around how many attempts do you get with the role plays? Look, TAFE has, and this is in your student information. TAFE has policies and procedures around how many opportunities a student has to resubmit before they may be deemed unsatisfactory and have to pay to redo that component. Okay, so I would encourage you to have a look at your student information around that, and sometimes as well there might be consideration granted to a student if there's extenuating circumstances. So it's a little bit difficult to give like an exact answer because it might be unique to students if there's an extenuating circumstance. Usually you'll be given at least 2 opportunities, and then on the 3rd opportunity, if you're deemed unsatisfactory, you may need to pay a fee to redo that. Okay, so usually it's 2 to 3 opportunities, but where there's extenuating circumstances, you know, that might be discussed with a student. So another question was around, can students have scripts? So can a student prepare like notes beforehand or a script beforehand? So we don't encourage students to write a word-for-word script for the role plays. Okay. Now the reasons for that, there's a couple. So one of the reasons for that is because you don't actually know what the client is going to say in your session. Yes, there's some background information in the case studies that you read, but remember, we want to be person-centered in our approach. So we also want to listen to what our clients are saying and respond in ways that are appropriate to what our client says. Okay, so if we come to a session with a word-for-word script written, if the client says something that's not part of my script, I'm going to be quite thrown by that. I might not be able to respond appropriately because I'm so concentrating on my pre-prepared script. Okay, so we don't encourage you to have scripts. It is okay for you to have some little prompt notes though. So students often, for example, might have a list of referral agencies written down that they kind of look at depending on what the client asks for. Or students might have some prompt notes to remind them to, say, ask about an interpreter. Or they might have a prompt note to remind them to make sure that they're setting SMART goals. So it's okay to have some prompt notes that you refer to, but we really discourage you from having a word-for-word script to work off. Okay? And the other question or comments that came up, and Vicky touched on this in what she was just talking about. We encourage students to approach these role plays as if they were happening in the workplace. Okay, it is a professional scenario. So what I mean by that is, please come to the role plays prepared. Please come to the role plays, find a space where you're not going to be overly distracted, for example. Things like being aware of the words or the language that we use. Okay. Even things like, and this might, for some people, this might sound like a little bit of an odd comment to make, but even things like not, having a cigarette during the role play session, for example, if you're somebody that smokes. Even though you're in your own home or you're somewhere comfortable to you, because we're doing this on MS Teams, we really want you to think about it as if you're in a work environment. So in a work environment, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to light up a cigarette while we're chatting with a client doing an assessment. So we want to take that approach even in our role play, even if we're sitting in our backyard, okay, do the role play. So please come to the role plays thinking about it as if it's a professional setting, as if it's in a workplace, and you are delivering a real service to a real client. So they were some of the questions that had come up during Vicky's session there. Are there any other questions that people may have about the role plays? Is there anything that you would like more information on? And remember, folks, if you have a question, it's highly likely that somebody else in this session has the same question or a similar question. So by asking that question, not only are you helping yourself, but you're also helping out some of your classmates as well. So if there's any questions or things you would like to clarify, and you can ask very specific questions to specific role plays if you would like to. So, oh, sorry. Yeah, was there a question? Anne, maybe?
Oh, sorry. Someone had a question? No. I was just going to say, just be aware of the background as well if you're on Teams. Did we mention about blurring the background?
That's a really good point, Vicky, that you've made. So, because we do these role plays on Teams, folks, you know, we're kind of inviting people into, perhaps it's our homes, perhaps it's our private office space, perhaps it's a library or wherever you might be. So because of that, there are some things you can do to maintain a degree of privacy or confidentiality in regards to your setting. So, you know, if you didn't want people to be able to see, you know, what your home looks like, for example, or maybe you've got, maybe your children are home and you don't want them to be seen in the background of the role play. So I'll show you how you can make some changes to your background setting as well. Okay, and students often ask about that. Just to maintain a little bit of, you know, a privacy, I suppose. So let me just change my shared screen. And Jasmine, I've seen you've just asked a question, so I'll come to that in just a moment as well. Okay, so I've just popped on my shared screen so you can see my Teams page again. Now, my camera is off at the moment, so remember to turn my camera on, I'd come up here to the camera icon, okay? And if I just hover on my camera icon, you'll see, I'll hop off for a moment, I'm going to hover on the camera icon and you'll see that I get a little drop box and it gives me, it says it's a private preview. So what this means is it's showing me, before I turn my camera on, it's showing me what people will be able to see once I turn my camera on. Okay, so I can see that at the moment my background is blurred, so people won't be able to see the background, and I'm okay with that. Now let's imagine that I looked at my private preview and I noticed that you can see my background and I wanted to change that. What I would do is I'd come to this little section here that says more background effects. Okay. And when I click on that, you will see that it opens a little box on the side and there's a range of different backgrounds I can turn on. So for example, I can just have a blurred background, which is what I've got at the moment. But I might decide that I want, you know, a background that looks a bit more like an office space. So I can pick this space. Now, I know the one I've picked because it gets a yellow border around it and a little tick. Okay, so I pick that and then I say apply and turn on video. So now you can see on my shared screen that my background is now this kind of fairly open office space. Okay, and I can see that some students have changed their backgrounds as well, so they're familiar with how to do that. So that's great to know. Okay, so just as a reminder, we go up to camera. Okay, when it's turned off, we can hover on it, and it will bring up a little background preview, which will allow us to then select a background. Okay. So I'm just going to change the shared screen again and move to Jasmine's question. Okay, so just one moment, folks. Now, Jasmine's question was what type of language? So you said using language, being mindful of the language that we use. So what does that mean? So when we're talking about being mindful of the language you use and approaching it from a professional place, you know, imagining you're in the workplace, it's things like using language that we think would be appropriate in the workplace. So for example, you may be a person who maybe uses the occasional swear word in your private life. In the workplace, it may not be appropriate for you to use the occasional swear word to the client, for example, because you don't know if they're comfortable with you know, particular language like that. So we're thinking about using language that would be appropriate in the workplace when we're working with clients, especially clients that maybe are coming from a vulnerable background or that may be experiencing a range of challenges. So things like being mindful of not using, you know, what might be deemed as, you know, swear words or those kinds of things. Also, as Vicky mentioned, things like not using jargon words. Okay, so when we're thinking about language, we don't want to use jargon words. So if I said to a client, oh, look, I'm going to have to speak to DCJ, they wouldn't know what that means. It's highly likely they wouldn't know what that means because that's an abbreviation that's used by people who already work in the community services sector. Okay, so we want to use, we don't want to use jargon words. And also in regards to language, we want to use words or language that is what's called strengths-based and recovery-focused language. Okay, so what I mean by that is we don't want to use language or words that maybe imply criticism or stigma or stereotyping. Okay, we want to use strengths-based or recovery language. And I'll give you an example of that. An example of that might be something like, we want to try and avoid saying to somebody something like, oh, it sounds like you're an alcoholic. Okay, because the term alcoholic has a lot of negative connotations attached to it. There's a lot of stigma that might be attached to that word. And it also labels the client as something. Okay, so what we might say instead is something like, you know, from what you've said, Jeff, it sounds like the drinking's causing a few problems for you at the moment. So it's slightly different wording, but there's less of a stigma attached to that. And it's also not labeling the client as something. So we're saying Jeff is still a person, and at the moment he's drinking alcohol. And maybe it's causing him some problems based on what he has said. So that's different from saying, Jeff, it sounds like you're an alcoholic. Okay. So that's one example of being mindful of the language we use. Okay, we want to use language that is supportive of clients, that is strengths focused, and what we might call recovery oriented. there's a really great resource that the Mental Health Council have put out that's called the Recovery Oriented Language Guide. And I'll post a little link to that in the chat box if you're interested in, looking at the words we use and the language around that. But, that's kind of some examples, Jasmine, of what we're talking about in regards to language. So looking at using professional language, so avoiding, swear words or very colloquial words. So, for example, again, you might be somebody who in your private life, you might say to your friends, oh, hey, Dal, how are you going? And that might be okay in your private life. But we might not want to use terms like that with clients, for example. Okay. We also want to use strengths-based language and try to avoid jargon terms. And Jasmine has said that that's been helpful. So great. Thank you, Jasmine, for that feedback. Wonderful. I'm just checking the time, folks. We're getting close to the end of the session. However, there is time for, another question or two if people have further questions. And again, remember, you can ask a very specific question about a specific role play that you're about to do, for example, if you wanted the chance to get some information now. So, and just while we're getting a little bit of space for anybody to ask any final questions, this is just a little example. We'll just do a very quick little example of some of the things that Vicky was discussing with you before in regards to communication. And Vicky gave some examples as well. But how this might be with actually some of your scenarios that we're looking at, okay? So let's imagine that our client says, something like, the doctor says I drink too much. So that's a statement from our client. Oh, look, the doctor says I drink too much. How might we respond to that? Thinking about some of the ideas that Vicky shared, how might we respond, or what might we be curious about? Does anybody have any thoughts on what you might ask that client about, or how you might respond to that client?
I've always got myself.
Natalie, I think your hand is up. If it is, yeah, go for it.
How much do you drink?
Yeah, so you might be curious about how much are they drinking? Absolutely. So we might ask a question like that. We might ask the client, how much are you drinking at the moment? Yep. Because that will start to help us get some information about, what does too much mean? Yep, great. Any other thoughts that people have about a question they might ask of this client? So we also might, oh, sorry, Samantha, I see your hand is up. Yeah.
I was thinking maybe I would ask if there's any plan from the doctor about what they're doing with their drinking.
Great. Okay, so that could be a good open question that you could ask this client. You might ask the client something like, okay, I'm wondering, what things has the doctor put in place around this? So maybe you might ask a question like that to get some more information. Yeah. And Natalie, I see your hand is up again. Go for it.
What time do you start drinking?
Okay, so we might be,
delay.
Yeah. So we might start to get curious about, when does the client drink? We might be curious about, like, what kinds of things trigger the client's drinking. Yeah, so when do they start drinking? What's happening before you open your first drink, or before you pour your first drink? What tends to be going on? Yeah, so we might call this being compassionately curious. Okay, being curious to learn more about the client's unique and individual experience. Okay, it helps to give us information. Jasmine, I see your hand is up. Go for it.
I just wrote in the text box basically asking them why they think it isn't a problem. Like, that would open up for them to justify or explain how they don't believe it's an issue and why. So I feel like you could get a lot from that as well. Like,
Great.
asking them why they disagree.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting idea that Jasmine's raised, another really good question, and it really fits with this idea of being person-centered and curious. Because at the moment, the client's giving us the doctor's opinion. The doctor says I drink too much. So I might be curious about, what does the client actually think? I know the doctor's opinion, but what's the client's opinion on all of this? So as Jasmine said, we might ask the client, we might say, okay, so the doctor thinks you're drinking too much. What do you think? What's your opinion on your alcohol use at the moment? So this is a very open question that allows the client to start telling us more of their experience, their story, and what's happening for them. So that's an interesting place to come at it from, Jasmine. So really well picked up. At the moment, all we have is the doctor's opinion. We would want to hear what the client's opinion is on this, or we would want to know, what does the client think about all of this? So we might ask the client, what do you think? What's your drinking like for you at the moment? So wonderful. So these are open questions that allows the client to tell us some more information. Just very quickly before we wrap up, there's another little example here around, again, something that might come up in one of your case studies, where a client might say, sorry, I'm a little embarrassed about my English. What might we want to do? How might we respond if a client said something like that to us? I'm sorry, I'm a little embarrassed about my English. Samantha, I see your hand. Go for it.
I could say you don't need to be embarrassed. If I could help, would I suggest if they would need a translator?
Wonderful. So we might say to the client, I hear that you're embarrassed, but I want you to know that, I really don't want you to feel embarrassed about your English skills. Would you like me to arrange an interpreter for us? Is there a language that you'd prefer us to speak in? Yeah, so great. So thinking about offering an interpreter to our client. Wonderful. And I'll just make a very quick comment about interpreters here, folks. Sometimes our client might say to us, I'm a bit embarrassed. Sorry, my English isn't very good. And we might say to a client something like, oh, no, I can understand you really well. Your English is actually really very clear. Like, that's great. And we might say that back to a client because what we're doing is we're trying to be encouraging and supportive. But we need to remember that interpreters are there to support both people in the conversation. So just because as a worker I can understand what the client's saying, it doesn't necessarily mean that the client can fully understand what I'm saying back to them. Okay? So we want to keep that in mind, that interpreters are there to support both people in the conversation. Because a client, if I said to a client, oh, no, I can understand you, your English is actually quite good, the client might not feel comfortable to then say, oh, actually, I'm struggling to understand you, because they might feel embarrassed. They might think that that's a rude thing to say to somebody. There might be cultural reasons why they don't want to say that back to the worker, because that might be seen as, being a rude thing to say to someone who's there to help you, or there might be power imbalances that suggest that they can't speak up like that. So if a client does make a comment about, their English skills, it could be always important for us to remember that interpreters support both us and our clients. And even if we think, this client's English is actually quite good, we may still want to make that offer of an interpreter, okay? Because the client might want an interpreter for their own benefits, okay? So I hope that makes sense for folks, what we're suggesting there. But Samantha's suggestion about offering an interpreter is a really a good starting point with this client. And when we offer a client an interpreter, what's another question that's really important to ask? So we're going to offer an interpreter. What else do we need to know? Samantha, I see your hand again. Go for it.
I would ask what their background is, or language.
Wonderful.
Their speaking language, sorry.
Yep, wonderful. So we want to remember to always ask, what is their preferred language? Okay, we don't want to make assumptions that, because a client is from a particular country, for example, that we know what their preferred language is. We always want to check in with them. What is their preferred language? So great suggestions from Samantha there. And Vicky's added a comment in there as well that fits with some of the cluster 2 role plays, that we also then might ask around, is there any preference around gender for that our client may have as well? Okay. So, folks, it's just about time for us to wrap up. While you're thinking about if there's any last questions you wanted to ask, I'm just going to throw to you, Vicky, to see if there's any comments that you wanted to offer before we wrap up. And I'm just going to post a little survey form asking folks if you're happy. It's an anonymous survey, so please know that, we won't know who has said what. But I'm going to just post a little survey form just asking people, to tell us some feedback about their experience of this session. So I'm going to throw to you, Vicky, and in doing that, perhaps you can address Bukra's question in the chat box as well, if that's okay, please.
Yep, I will. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for all of that. It's been very helpful. Bukra, you said, would it be encouraged to dress in business wear or business casual during our role play? I would suggest you could come dressed, not over casual, but just in presentation that you would, that's respectful to the teacher when you come. So we don't expect you to get into business dress or, over dress, but come respectfully dressed. So, you wouldn't rock up with a sort of a midriff showing and, sort of over casual clothes, but something that demonstrates to the assessor, the teacher, that you're really taking this seriously and that that you're being assessed professionally. So it doesn't have to be full makeup and for a person if that's what they would wear to work, but something that's smart casual, what I would say smart casual. Yeah, so are there any other questions that anybody'd like to just ask? You can put your mic on and speak if there's something. Just want to reassure everybody that the teachers as assessors, we're there to encourage you and support you through the role play. A good thing to do is to come prepared. So look at the role play that is attached to the units. So you might be doing a role play, say in cluster 6 or 7 in a certificate 4, or you may be doing a role play that's for youth work or mental health. Look at the unit learning that's attached to that specific role play. If it's talking about a modality of care, then you'd be thinking, well, the questions that I'm going to be asking are around that. So have your assessment criteria next to you, and then look through, do an overview of the unit of learning or the units of learning within that cluster, and be thinking about, well, if I were to be responding to a client using this model of care, say in a person-centered care, then think of the language you would use that reflects that, or from a strengths model or a trauma-informed care. Think of the language around that that you would be using in your response, and also the questions that you may, your open questions that you might be asking the client in the role play. So whilst there's the role play scenario, obviously the role plays, that's a loose interpretation of the scenario, but look at the questions and think, well, if I was working in a trauma-informed model, what would this type of concepts or language that would I be using when I'm speaking with the client, or what would I be looking at to put in a plan in place for the client? So it's that that's what the assessor will be looking for in those role plays, to see that you're actually reflecting the learning. And that's the same for any of the role plays, is that really the role plays is assessing your understanding of the learning, the theory. So it's the opportunity, it's the practical application of that theory. So if you're thinking around diversity, and you're doing a role play that is, it's looking at those three areas, say in the cluster 2, you're thinking about cultural diversity. We're thinking about, we talk about putting, if you think of your assessments, it's asks you questions around, creating culturally sensitive and culturally safe spaces for your clients. So you're then going to be thinking, well, I need to understand a little bit about the impact of the history. What's the history of this cultural group? What's the what are the taboos, languages around this cultural group that I may not, would be best not to use? So it's really the application of that knowledge in the role play. So for the preparation, what I guess what I'm saying is the preparation for your role play is to understand the learning in those module, that units of learning in that cluster, if the role play is associated with a specific cluster, because that's what the role play is assessing you against, is that learning. So I think if you can't vote, okay.
Yep. So thanks for folks who have voted. And thank you, Vicky, for those comments. I think, again, great guidance around, being aware of what's the subject-specific skills that you may need to be demonstrating, and connecting your learning to then practically putting into practice. So wonderful. Now, we're about to wrap up, folks. So just so you know, I have posted a link in the chat box to that language guide that I had mentioned, okay? So it's in the chat box, and it's produced by the Mental Health Coordinating Council, and it's called the Recovery Oriented Language Guide, okay? So if you can't access that link from the chat box, if you Google MHCC Recovery Oriented Language Guide, you'll find it pretty quickly, okay? So that's there. And very quickly, there was one last question. I think it was from Jasmine in regards to services that you might make referrals to. So as I mentioned, we want you to make referrals to real services, so existing real services. But Jasmine's question was, do I look for services in my local area? or do I look for services in other areas? So the answer to that may depend a little bit in part on where you live. And the reason I say that is because if you live, for example, in the middle of metropolitan Sydney CBD, there might be loads of local services that you could refer these clients to. If you live in a more kind of rural or remote area, maybe you live in Broken Hill and you're studying from Broken Hill, perhaps there's not as many local services that you can refer these clients to. So if that's the case, it is okay for you to be looking for things like, are there online services that we could refer this client to? You know, what are the services that I would refer this client to if they were in my area? So, you know, if you are living in an area that doesn't, for example, have a service that works specifically with the LGBTIQ plus community, if you found a real service that works with that community and it's in a different location, it's okay for you to still use that in your role plays. Okay, you'd be looking for, you know, what's the nearest by one I can access for a client, or you might be looking at, as I said, you know, are there online services? Because there's these days there's a lot of organisations are now offering things like, you know, sessions via things like Zoom and Teams. And, you know, web-based chat and those kinds of things. So I hope, Jasmine, that's answered that question for you. Look, thank you to the folks who have offered their feedback. Really appreciate it. It helps Vicky and I to kind of keep shaping this webinar because the information we provide essentially is based on what students ask us about. So thank you for that. And I really want to thank you all for joining us today. And I want to thank you all for participating today. Quite a few of you have either asked questions in the chat box, popped your microphones on and asked questions, or even, you know, gave some examples of questions you might ask clients. So I really want to thank you for sharing that with us. So thank you very much, folks. This recording will become available, so you can go back and watch it and listen to it again and have a look at the notes that were on the shared screen. And we will be continuing to run this session each week. Just so you know, TAFE Digital is also looking at kind of creating some additional complementary sessions around role plays as well that might focus on things like, for example, very specific role play tasks depending on the course you're in or the cluster of units that you're in. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody, for your participation, and thank you, Vicky, for all of your input and for all of the experience and knowledge that you've shared with us all today as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Glenn. Likewise. Thank you. Thanks for everyone for attending. That's great. The questions have been really great. As Glenn says, they actually help us provide, you know, answers to what a lot of students ask. So we are actually, each time we find that there is more and more information going into our drop-in sessions as well. So thank you for your attendance. And I noticed that quite a few people have